Hi, welcome to episode 3 of American Tributaries, where to break out of the bubbles we've all been in the last few years, we are engaging in a modern day Lewis and Clark journey by having conversations with the various currents of people in our country. Today, I'm real excited to have on a good friend, Frank Vito. Frank and I went to high school together at Smithtown High School East back in the 80s. And I guess 30 plus years later, Frank finds himself back in high school again. He's a high school teacher at Cranford High School in Union County, New Jersey. Frank, thanks so much for joining me tonight. How are you doing?
Good. How are you? Thanks,
Uh,
Mike.
Thank you. I was looking at the number of teachers in the country, and it said there's like 3 million teachers. Does that sound like a number you've heard before?
I guess so. I really haven't, you know, looked into that number or had something in my head about how many teachers there actually are.
Mm.
But, but I guess out of, 330, 340 million, 3 million teachers sounds about right.
Yeah, and for comparison's sake, like the number of active duty military people is about 1.4 million. So, I mean, you guys really are like the lifeblood of the country. So, I mean, I think we've seen it all more than ever over the last few years. How's it been? Like, I guess in the pandemic world as a teacher.
It's definitely been a challenge. It's weird not to be able to interact with kids on a daily basis. Meaning last year when we were kind of half virtual, half the students in person. But even this year, the interactions is still kind of weird because of the masks. I'm
Mm.
very excited. Recently, our governor in New Jersey said March 7th it'll be optional to
Hmm.
wear masks, and
Hmm.
you know, leaving COVID to the side, I'm just so excited if I can see some kids' faces again fully, because it's
Hmm.
it's such an important part of teaching is the interaction. So when we were on the on the virtual teaching way, it was definitely the most challenging part I had in my 23 years of teaching, where I couldn't interact with my students the way I want to interact with my students. But
Right.
we're getting back, just like everyone else is, and we're gonna learn from it. We're gonna move on, and if anything, it's probably gonna make us better people and more appreciative of interactions and relationships. So let's hope that's where we're going,
Yeah.
the end of this year and to the future.
Now, like for me, I think over the last 2 years, I've started writing, and I have like 40 articles written, and now I'm starting a podcast. What about like for you? Are there things that you're doing differently or doing new now that you didn't do before that you're going to continue doing once we get to some like real kind of sense of like normalcy?
So the one thing that I was able to do because of the schedule last year, I only had half days because we were virtual. With half the students in our school, my afternoons weren't as busy. I would meet with some students in the afternoon if they needed extra help or to take a quiz. But I was at home, so I had more free time than I've ever had as a teacher.
Mm.
Which normally worked in the school till at least 3 o'clock. So I started to read for pleasure more than I've had in such a long time. So I read a bunch of books last year, and I continued this school year to read more. And it's such everyone should read more. But I've been reading. I'm a history teacher, so I've read a lot of nonfiction. But for the first time, it's funny that you brought this up. I have a book right here, The Martian.
That's a
Uh, you
great
know,
book.
so I'm reading that. It's the movie, but this is obviously the book version.
Yeah.
So that's been my one. If there's been one positive about just my life as a teacher slash person, it's my ability to read and finally be able to my kids are a little bit older, and I'm sure I'll talk about them, but just to find that time, it's great. I'm so happy.
Yeah. Do you find that do the chill like I guess your students, do you find that they read, or is there kind of like been I don't, and to be honest, like I don't think I was doing any recreational reading in high school. I think that kind of stopped in elementary
I would
school.
say there's out of my students, there's maybe one or two that are, reading lovers that read it for recreation purposes.
Right.
So I don't think in the past year that happened more for any student out there. I wish it did, but I don't think it
Hmm.
did.
Yeah.
But what I will say is I brought it up, and then something, I always try to connect with my students as best I can. It did start some random conversations with kids that I would not have thought as readers or recreational readers. And they came to me after class, or, said something on a Zoom. Hey, you know what? You said you were reading. I actually am reading a book for pleasure. And I thought that was really neat because it's something that I never really shared with my students because I wasn't really doing it very often. So
Right.
now that I was like, you know what? I want to tell them about, a random Malcolm Gladwell book or something like that. And it did make me connect with a couple students.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, to me, I find that like the with reading with books, it really lets you, like, kind of lets you slow things down, and it really lets you kind of. It's an exercise in putting shoes on someplace else and being somebody else, or just it kind of really like kind of stepping into somebody else's shoes, and it's utterly different than social media or even reading the newspaper or watching television. And I love it, and I try to read at least at night at least a couple of pages before I go to sleep. But even on the subway, I carry a book around now, and I try to read that over, like looking at whatever the latest news update is or something.
Now, I agree with your when you read a book as opposed to watching a movie or TV or reading a newspaper. It's not really written that way. It's just to kind of give you some information. But a book is the way they're written most of the time. You put yourself into the character, whatever it is, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, or short stories. I you feel it so much more because you don't have a visual, so you kind of have to create the visual in your mind while you're reading. So that's it's something really neat. Like I said before, to be able to connect with reading again, maybe that's the one positive that's going to come out of it for me personally.
Well, just an FYI, the Martian, I about the Martian is my last interview was with a woman from that I know from college who is a like legit NASA scientist with like a PhD in extraterrestrial like geology, and I asked her about like the books and movies and how legit they are, and she said like the Martian took some liberties, but it's pretty darn accurate.
That's neat. That's really neat.
So it's good stuff. So how is high school different than it was when we were walking the hallways of Smithtown High School East? And I'll say, like, one thing I wonder is there a pit like place in high schools these days, or
No, so yeah, when we were in school, back in the '80s, when it came to things like the social norms are a little bit different in regards to smoking cigarettes, even I want to say you know drinking or any other recreational activities that might have been going on. I'm sure they happen, they just happen in a much different way.
Mhm.
um not that I want to say a secretive way. I just don't think.
It's not as overt?
Yeah, not as overt. That's a good word to say.
Mhm.
But overall, the you know high school students are always high school students, and
Mhm.
it's to me that it's why I wanted to teach that age group. They're past adolescence, and they're really turning into young adults, like kind of before your eyes from ninth, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. Ninth graders come in, and I think it's always been this way that they're still a little bit immature, and
Mhm.
by the end of ninth grade and the beginning of 10th grade, you start to see a change where they're becoming young adults. And I mostly have juniors and seniors. And by that time, you can talk to them like they are an adult. And it's one of the ways I think I connect very well with my students is a lot of my students have said, like, he treats us like a person, not like just a student. So
Mhm.
it's that, the key. And I think that's the way when I remember high school, that's who I like. My teachers are the best that I connected with, on a personal level that you really don't get in the younger grades. So I still think high school is that perfect mix of just young people and teacher adults, and how they're just trying to get through learning and moving on.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that when I recall those days, I never realized, I guess, how, I guess, self-absorbed I was as a high school. But I think that's also like, that's the freedom you have at that point. Like, you don't have those responsibilities. I don't say that necessarily as a downside. I think that that's the point, is you're a high schooler and you're trying to figure things out. So to like your point, a 14, 15, 16, 17 year old is kind of the same thing. Do you ever find yourself becoming like the "hey, get off my lawn" type, like, older guy, or how do you keep yourself like fresh? Because I feel like the constant thing I hear a lot now is like, "oh, these millennials or Gen Z, whatever," like, people complaining about the next generation, and I always try to kind of center, or I guess, like, center myself to be like, look, when we were younger, like, we were sitting and watching MTV for 3 or 4 hours straight. Like, how much worse is that than, or better is that than TikTok, right? Or how much, I was watching Gilligan's Island and Brady Bunch. Like, why is TikTok so much worse than that? But do you find, is it do you have to fight the impulse to feel like the older guy who's complaining about the younger kids, or like, what's it like? Because you're confronted with that every day. Your entire profession is being confronted with younger and younger kids that you're just not a part of that generation. Not to say that you're old, because you're young at heart.
All right, so I have two, I guess, issue type feelings. One was prior to the pandemic, was vaping. Was all of a sudden, infiltrating my school, and high schools and middle schools, even, it seemed like, across the country. And the one thing that I had such a problem with, and I grew up in a world that there was cigarettes, and some of my friends smoked, and my parents, my mom smoked. So I've been an anti-smoking person my whole life. So then it seemed like smoking pretty much disappeared. Maybe there was a handful of kids smoking cigarettes still in my school. But then this vaping thing came out, which was supposed to curb people smoking, and so many kids were doing it. And I feel like the pandemic, maybe it's another positive, that because they weren't in school, and the vaping is like kind of a social thing, they weren't doing it as much. But so right before the pandemic, it was driving me nuts, because I was like, we are living in a world where cigarettes are almost extinct, because there's not any new smokers that are going to become smokers as adults. But vaping became this thing that I was really anti-vaping, and I would bring it up in class all the time. I'm like, guys, why are you doing this? It's so bad for your bodies, and you're going to become addicted to nicotine. And that was when I felt like the old Generation X person talking to a millennial, or a Generation Z. But the other thing that's kind of interesting about get off my lawn was I was like on the border with it, but now, because of laptops and the pandemic, I've taken a step back, and it was just the use of a cell phone. Like you said, they're kind of always on technology. So I was getting bothered with it. I'm like, they don't want to talk anymore. They just want to go on their phone. They just want to go on their phone. But now, because we're using laptops so much more in school, it's made me take a step back and say, or you know what? I'm not going to be the anti-technology person, because I've had to use it so much more in the last 2 years. And maybe it's just that's the new norm. So I'm not going to be anti-technology. I'm not going to be the old guy. I'm going to just be with it, and just see how they use it, and why they're using it, and how they interact with technology. It's just the next level, that, like you said about MTV, TikTok is their MTV. Their Fortnite is our Pac-Man. So
Yeah.
whatever the technology is, you just kind of have to go with it, because it's not going away, and we're not going to go back to where there was no technology. So I try to be as young and as energetic as I can, as a 51 year old. But and I want to stay young, because I think that's how, like I said before, I connect with my students. So I'm trying to not be the get off my lawn. person.
I'm sure you'd be very nice if you were telling them to get off the lawn, but but I think the other thing is that, like, I think it's old. You can really almost flip the script on technology. It's easy to complain about it, but it is such an empowering tool we have now. I mean, like, you can start a business with nothing more than like your computer. If I like to look at my job as in like wine importing. Like, 2 generations ago, if you wanted to import wine from France, you basically had to like know French fluently, and you had to have been there. You had to be able to read like a map. And if you went to France, you would be driving around the countryside using maps, and you'd get lost, and you'd have to use French. And if you didn't know French, you were like, you were out of luck, and you'd be going blind basically. But nowadays, you can use Google Maps to plan out where you're going. You can go to their websites, and you can email people, and you can go there and use Google Translate, and you can do things so much easier. So the barriers to entry for almost any job and almost any profession is so much lower than it was before. And I think that's an amazing thing. And there are certainly bad parts to technology, but I think that's an exciting threshold to be on, where it's like, you really can do anything. Like, we're sitting here and doing a podcast, and 10 years ago, 15 years ago, this wouldn't be possible. It was only done by people who work for CNN or Fox or a couple of news channels. So I guess what that makes me think about sometimes is, like, in education, like, I kind of think that it almost has to mean that, like, the prestige of college or the need to go to college has got to be less. Like, you don't necessarily need to get that stamp. I mean, obviously there's certifications and certain kind of professional requirements, but do you see any change in how people look at going to college? Because there's Steve Jobs, who didn't who dropped out of college. There's Bill Gates, who never graduated from college. There's Mark Zuckerberg. There's so many stories of people who didn't go to college and are wildly successful. Not that that is the only reason why you go to college, but at least it's out there. So what do you see?
I haven't seen that, like, personally, just because still when they're in 11th and 12th grade, there's such a feeling of what's next. And not that I'm saying college is the easier choice,
Hmm.
but it seems like the norm for the last 20 years.
Hmm.
So that's where everyone assumes they're heading.
Hmm.
But I would be interested to see, how many students do go to, college for 4 years. I don't know my statistics of my students and where they've ended up, and how successful they've come. I've only talked to, probably out of the thousands of students I have had over the last 23 years, maybe a couple hundred. And I don't really know even their success stories, or what they're doing that much.
Hmm.
Maybe a little bit of connection on Facebook, but I wish I could, do a statistical analysis of my former students to see what they did for, the 4 years after college, and, what jobs they ended up with and things like that.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's an exciting time, and I think that one of I prepared myself when my kids were going to become adolescents by thinking, like, look, the world they're going to be in is going to be different than the world that I'm in. So while I like to tell them, like, look, I'm like your coach. Like, I know that you're not going to think I'm your life coach, but I'm here to kind of at least impart all the lessons I've had, because I have a lot of painful lessons that I've learned from. So I hope you can benefit too. But I understand that you're going to be pushing back on things, and you should push back on things.
Sounds
So,
good.
yeah. So what was your path to get in? Actually, one thing I wanted first is, while we're talking about it, is like, I guess my impression of teachers, and I know that there's stuff that happens outside of this, but it's like, a teacher's on the clock during the school day. So okay, a teacher is working from whenever school opens until the end of the school day at the end of the last period. Like, when in normal times, like, what is life like outside of that stuff? Like, how much work are you doing before? How much work are you doing, like, preparing for school after? Like, what's it like? What is it behind the scenes? What's going on?
Behind the scenes of a teacher. So, we teach, basically, I guess, from 8 o'clock to 3 o'clock. And when I am in school, it is really 8 o'clock to 3 o'clock. There's not a lot of downtime. I'm either grading papers, or like making photocopies, or typing something up on the computer. and then boom, then the next class will come in, and then then I'm on. And there's, even when I'm not in front of the classroom and they might be working on something, there's, I'm still on. So it's weird that for that, 7 hours you're on fire. But when I'm not in the classroom, you could do it at your own pace, and that's the greatest thing, especially now that my kids are older and I'm an experienced teacher, is I know when to plan and how to plan so much better. So it used to be hours thinking about the lessons for the next day or the next week, where now it's not hours, it's probably, maybe, a half hour to an hour planning for the week, because I already, know my curriculum well. I know, how long things take, an activity or reading. So that's a little bit less time, but I still will have to grade papers outside of school, and, you can't grade them until, you give an assignment or a test. So, I try to make time each evening to do that. And if I don't, because of, my activities with my family, then I'll save it for the next day, or, sometimes on a Saturday or Sunday. That's what I'm doing. Lesson planning and grading some papers outside of school that you really can't do that much in school. Like you think even when you have a free period or a prep period that you're going to get so much done. But like I said, next thing you know, the bell rings and the students show up, and you have to put that to the side.
Mm-hmm. Um, and I guess one thing I wonder is, like, when you do a class, like how much of that is like, I mean, it's obviously not scripted, but like when you're going to teach a class, how much do you just have like just an idea and you just kind of riff off of that? Do you have bullet points that you're kind of referring to? Like how does that work?
So it's a little bit of everything that you just said. Some of it's riffing, some of it's, just what happens in the class and the moment of a discussion. Other times I will have some bullet points written down that I'm like, oh, I have to get to this, besides if I'm giving them notes or we're going over reading. Other times it will be, and this is something that takes years to develop. And, I've worked with other teachers talking about it, and my supervisor, is the idea of follow-up questions. So whatever you're going over, to be able to ask a question that will lead to more discussion. And, the perfect world would be students asking other students questions. And that's really hard to get if that's the goal. But I've, again, because I think I'm pretty experienced doing this, that's the thing I try to come up with the most, to if you want to talk it as it's a script for what my lesson's going to be, is those, all right, after I do this activity, what's the question that isn't even on something that they had to write or think about, to get them to reflect on whatever the activity or, reading was. That those follow-up questions to kind of keep the story going,
Mm-hmm.
whatever the subject matter might be.
When I don't, I have to, I teach a very insignificant thing and not much of it. I just teach about wine. But like, at least when I'm talking to people about wine, what I feel like is what I want them to kind of leave. And it sounds like you take this for your teaching as well. As I always feel like I don't want them to necessarily know the facts I'm teaching them. I want them to be curious, and I want them to learn on their own when they're gone, from me. And that to me is what's more important. Um, and it sounds like that's what you try to do as well.
Yeah, so, obviously as a history teacher, we're always trying to connect it to the present, connect it to the student and their lives now, whatever the subject matter may be. But that's the other thing, and students have come to me, or, emailed me, years later, and said, you know what, something happened and it connected to what you said years ago, and I didn't understand it years ago, but I understand it now. And I was like, yes. I was like, that made me so happy. And of course I would like save that letter, print out that email, because that's kind of like you said, it's what we're here for. You want to be like lifelong learners with whatever you're, interacting with people on, whether it's wine or, history.
Mm-hmm. What why did you choose history?
So I didn't like start. In high school, I liked all subjects. I liked math. I liked science. I even, I liked English, and I liked my electives for that matter. I ended up in high school, like you said before, because I liked high school. It was really weird, even though I never thought I was going to become a teacher. But I will say my favorite teacher in high school was Mr. Kane, who was my history teacher in 11th grade for U.S. history, and he was also my a class, an elective I took in 12th grade called Law and Judicial. So he was my favorite teacher, but history wasn't my favorite subject. I thought math was my favorite subject. I took accounting as a senior for an elective. And when I went to college my freshman year, I started out as an accounting major. But after about a semester, and I'm taking, I think, one accounting class and one other class in business, I was just like, I do not like this subject as well as I thought I did. And I was taking, I think, Western Civ 1, and I took another history class. And I said, I like these history classes better than I like these accounting and business classes. So I ended up transferring from Siena College to Stony Brook, after my freshman year. And then they said, you have to declare a major. And I was like, all right, I'm going to be a history major. And that's what took me on the path for history, not becoming a history teacher, though. So it was, I would say, my freshman year, a change in my mindset of what my favorite subject was, not having any idea what my future career would be. So that's what's really odd about my becoming a history teacher now. I had to make a couple of jumps to go back to school and do all that.
Wow. And and then what was your path? We've talked about this, but I think it seems to be a pretty unique path. So you graduate from college, you have your history degree. There was a couple of years between that and when you end up actually teaching. So can you can you go over that?
Yes, so I graduated with a history degree back in 1993, and I just was trying to get a job, right after college in the in the real world, So I found a job. The one job I was offered was I went to a place that was a headhunting place, and their job was to find people jobs. So while I was on the interview there, they set me up with one interview at a place called Arrow Electronics. I don't even know if it still exists on Long Island, and I didn't get that job. But after that, they called me up and said, hey, we really liked you during the interview. We have an opening here at our company getting people jobs, like a headhunter, a temporary employment agency. So that was my first job out of college. And I ended up doing that for 3 years.
Wow.
Um, for one company for about 2 years, 2.5 years, and the other company for I think about 8 months. So I did that for about 3 years, getting people jobs. But in the meantime, other things were going on in my life. My parents moved to Florida from Long Island, and then my girlfriend from college became my fiance, and she graduated grad school, and she got a job offer as a school psychologist in upstate New York. And that's what took us to upstate New York, her getting a job up in Delhi. So from there, we moved to upstate New York, and I thought it was going to be easy to find a job. I have 3 years of work experience under my belt. I got a college degree. I could do anything. And it took a couple months actually to find a legitimate job. And I had some weird interviews. I even went on a job to be a vacuum salesman in Binghamton, New York, which was like an hour away from Oneonta where we lived. But I ended up working getting a job at an opera company up in Cooperstown called Glimmerglass Opera, working in, this is the irony of it all, working in the accounting and finance department of this very seasonal opera company, but it had a year round staff. So I was I'm putting in quotes, accounting worker. I didn't really do much accounting. I was doing very low level top type finance work for this opera company. But it was just, things go full circle in life. I thought I was going to work in accounting, and I kind of ended up doing that for a year. So I worked at an opera company for a year. Then I started to realize, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? So my wife, she became my wife during this time period. She's working at a school. She's a school psychologist, and I just started thinking, it seems like a good job. A teacher. I might be able to do that. I liked history. I have a history degree, so I visited the admissions office at Oneonta State and asked them what I would need to do to become a teacher. And looking at my credits and my transcript, they were able to determine that within 1 year, if I took a bunch of classes, spring semester, a bunch of classes, summer semester, and student teaching in the fall, I could do it within 1 year, get my teaching certification. And I did have a couple of education credits from undergrad at Stony Brook. So that I did that in a year. Weird story was that December was 1997 or 1998. I'm lost for the years, but it was when Mark McGuire and Sammy Sosa were having the home run chase to break Roger Maris's record. And weird thing is, through the opera, a girl that worked at the opera had a boyfriend that worked at the Baseball Hall of Fame that's also in Cooperstown. There was this picture in Newsday in the sports section back to Roger Maris's home run in 1961, his 61st home run. And in the background of this photo was my wife's grandfather, who was an usher at Yankee Stadium. So when this photo appeared in Newsday, I ended up calling up the girl I worked with's boyfriend at the Baseball Hall of Fame and said, hey, do you guys have this photo of Roger Maris hitting his 61st home run and tipping his helmet? Because I need something in the background of that photo. And he did have that photo at the Baseball Hall of Fame. So I ended up ordering the photo from my in-laws, so that they would have this of their the grandfather that was an usher at Yankee Stadium. But while I was talking to my friend at the Hall of Fame, he said, "Oh, I know you're finishing your student teaching. What are you going to do next?" And I said, "Well, I'll probably start substituting, next month in January when we're done with the holidays." And he said, "You know what? There's an opening at the Baseball Hall of Fame." So in the research department in the library of the Baseball Hall of Fame, obviously I have a history degree, and I talked to this guy about baseball a couple times. So I ended up getting a job at the Baseball Hall of Fame for 8 months after my student teaching, before I found my first teaching job. And in that eight
Wow.
months, obviously it was a fantastic job and opportunity. I met a lot of interesting people, baseball, players, but also, the staff at the Hall of Fame, where I still have some friends still to this day, I don't know how many years later, now 20, 23 years later. But that was my little job. And then obviously now for 23 years, I've been a teacher. So it was a very interesting route to become where I am today. But, all the little steps helped me become who I am, and maybe, a better teacher, a more well-rounded person, and all those other things that
Yeah.
come with life.
Wow. That's the thinking about like baseball, one of the things that strikes me is people, it's easy. I hear people like complain about how boring baseball is, and obviously there's not necessarily a lot of action on the field compared to other sports, but I think baseball to me is like the ultimate like four-dimensional sport. And what I mean by that is, like, if you're watching like the Yankees Red Sox and you're only thinking about what's on the field, you're missing the whole fact that there's like a long 100-year history. So, and that's the fourth dimension. And it's, if you're a Mets fan, it's, the fourth dimension is like, decades of losing. Like, but I think there's so much more. And I love the pace of baseball. And frankly, I mean, even to your point about like, your path to being a teacher, life is, has its, curveballs, and it doesn't go as scripted. You don't bat 1,000, you bat 300 sometimes, and sometimes you get on a hot streak, and sometimes you have a slump, and that's life. And that to me is why I have an affection for baseball that I think is pretty like unshakable. So I don't know if you saw that, and did working at the Hall of Fame kind of add to your affection for baseball? Did it change it?
All those things you said and more.
Mm,
When we just had the Field of Dreams game this past season in baseball, when they played in Iowa, just all like those special movies like Bull Durham and Field of Dreams, and even it was on the other night, A League of Their Own. There's so many great baseball movies, and then the story just takes it to another level where there's a feeling to baseball and the game and what it does, and having a catch with your dad and playing t-ball and just you know there's so many things, and I love your references to like a curveball and batting 300 in life. Like there's so many things there that yes, if you're when I watch a baseball game, it's not just what's going on in the TV. There's all that other things that happened. You know, I think I must mention Jackie Robinson. Breaking the color barrier in 1947 in all my history classes multiple times. They if they leave my class, they've heard me say it 3 times. By the end of the school year, because it's so important to the civil rights movement and the world that we live in. To know that that's such a an integral part of desegregation, is that. So it's like there's so many little things, and they say it in Field of Dreams. It's like there's one constant. It's baseball. When what's his name says it. I can't think of the actor's name. Darth Vader.
Uh,
Earl
yeah,
Jones,
yeah,
James Earl
James Earl
Jones.
Jones. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So what's really funny is because I worked at the Baseball Hall of Fame, I have a lot of stuff in my classroom, but I do have photos that I was able to get copies of at the Baseball Hall of Fame. I have like 4 photos. One is Jackie Robinson, one is Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, one is Taft throwing out the first pitch, from the stands, but he's the first president to throw out a ball. And there's a picture of Abner Doubleday. So I have these, and a picture of the original Yankee Stadium. So I have these photos in the back of my room, and there's a couple little movie posters. I have 42, and I have A League of Their Own, and it just it's my connection to my past job and history, of course, because baseball is such an important part of it. But it's funny. My students really don't say anything. Like you have all these history movie posters, and you have pictures of presidents. What's the deal with that little baseball corner on your bulletin board? But it's to me, it's so special, and it's a part of my past, and obviously my love of baseball and how I connect it to everything. But it's just always there, and it's in the back of my room, and it always comes back to me that 8 months, and then other things I did at the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I know you did. Did you meet who was the most interesting people that you met when you were at the Hall of Fame that you are comfortable to talk about?
So, I met a bunch of Hall of Famers, people like Reggie Jackson. I drove, one of the jobs after working at the Baseball Hall of Fame was I worked a lot of inductions. And one of the coolest jobs I did was transportation, which was getting Hall of Famers from the Albany airport to Cooperstown, which is about a 90-minute drive. But also maybe driving them around town for that weekend when they have to get to places around Cooperstown. So at Reggie Jackson, Steve Carlton, Mike Schmidt, I drove like every one of the players that we grew up watching in the 1970s and 80s, which was amazing. But my last year that I lived in upstate New York and worked at the last induction I worked at was Cal Ripken and Tony Gwynn's induction. And Tony Gwynn became one of my favorite players when Greg Nettles got traded to the Padres. He was a young player on that team, and then he ended up becoming my favorite player. And I drove him around Cooperstown twice that weekend. I didn't drive him from Albany, so I didn't have him in the car for 90 minutes, but I did have him in the car for about 25 minutes that weekend, and I was able to talk to him a little bit. But even just talking to his wife, and the wives sometimes are better than the players and the and the guys in the back of the car, because I'm just this random driver, but the wife will be like, oh, what do you do when you're not driving, for the Hall of Fame? And I would say I'm a teacher. It's stuff like that. So meeting, Tony Gwynn, and then Tony Gwynn's wife and one of his daughters who sang the national anthem at the induction was really neat. And, it was like meeting my childhood idol. And just, I'm like, I have this guy sitting shotgun next to me. It was amazing, even though I didn't really talk as much as I would have liked to, because I was just his driver. But I did interact with him, and I definitely interacted with his wife. It was really neat. That was the most special thing that happened. And it being my last induction that I worked, back in 2007. I'll never forget it. I have some photos and memorabilia from that weekend hanging in my basement.
Wow. That that's a magical time, and that's something you can always kind of like look back on, and it's pretty unique. Like I find that there's a lot of things that like I did, when I was like in the Navy, where like as at the time you're just kind of doing it and you don't really think about it, but when you get older you realize like kind of life, not that it gets boring, but you get into routine and you have all those other responsibilities, and you just like you don't have the luxury of just doing that, and you don't really have like the randomness of just kind of being able to do that. So that's pretty special, memory. Are your kids like, are they interested by that thing, or they're just like, oh, dad, like, stop, we've already heard that 1,000 times?
No, I would say my kids have no interest in my Tony Gwynn or just baseball stories. Once in a while, my students, when I've told some random classes out of the blue that I'd worked at the Baseball Hall of Fame and that I drove Hall of Famers around, it would just be like, wow, that's totally different, because I wouldn't expect that from a teacher. They just always think I was a teacher, probably. But I would say that the story usually goes over well with people that are a little bit older and appreciate the game. And when I mention a Reggie Jackson or a Tony Gwynn, certain people's eyes light up because they remember how great those players were.
Mm-hmm. You to change tack a little bit, because one of the things I've noticed with like school and with the kids, for us, is these days, like the you get emails from the school, and you get emails from the PTA, and you get emails from the teachers, and I think back to like when we went to school, where it was just basically like, I went off to school, and nobody, like my mother didn't know what was happening to me when I was there, and she didn't know about what was happening with school unless I brought back something that was letting, or if they mailed something, right, which they really weren't doing. So it seems to me that in our generation, it was a lot it was probably a lot easier to be a teacher and to be an administrator than it is now. Like, computers give you a lot, but it seems to me that, in some respects, like, you're, as a teacher and as a school, you're experiencing what, like, I don't know, the whole country and what politicians experience. It was like now, like, everybody is always on you. Like, so it just seems like teacher, like, because I see it like, this, or high school for my daughter will announce something, and then all of a sudden there's like 50 parents who are like, why are we doing this, what about that, what about this? So it's like it just seems to be a lot more complicated, and I'm wondering, like, is it that way? And then, I mean, I guess, like what would you, if you could like tell parents or kids, like this is like what they don't know, like what they don't appreciate about, and not to say like not appreciate it, but just like something like, when you lift the curtain up, like, this is what's going on, this is what we're trying to do, this is why it's so hard, or you know it's kind of an open-ended question. I don't even know where I'm
No,
going.
I have lots of different avenues for this one. So when I'm first off, I think that the media, there's there's not as much interactions as you think. That there probably should be even more interactions between a school and parents. You're hearing these stories, but I still think there are a lot less of them than there actually. It seems like in the media that it's happening every day at every school board meeting, or you know. So I think it's happening less than it sounds like it is, in regards to some kind of interaction between school and parents. Um, but the one thing I will say is, you could pretty much now, you could look at any given time what your student's grade is, what assignments, because Google Classroom, that's what we use at my school, it's all there. It'll say if something is due tomorrow, or, it was due last week and you didn't hand it in and it's still missing. So there's definitely, there was definitely less communication when we were in school. So the technology has made it easier, I think, for parents to look at what's going on. And I don't think they're doing that enough, because I'll get emails to say, like, can you tell me what assignments my son or daughter is missing? And I'm like, yeah, sure, here's the list. But they could have easily just gone on to Google Classroom or to the report card and see what says 0 or missing. So it's just, I think that's kind of like a weird story that we keep hearing about. You don't know what's going on in the classroom. But so the other direction I was going to take it, though, was the coolest thing to me now, and it happened last year, is some random, mom or dad listening in on the class that was going on, over virtual teaching. And and moms or dads, for the most part, be saying things like, I think I was more interested in your lesson than my student was. I wish I was in the class again. So to me, that was the one positive that the virtual had, when maybe it had, some parents listening in appreciated teachers more, appreciated subject more. And I hope that's, maybe something that you don't hear enough on the media, that, we're here, we're people. We're the same teachers that you grew up with. Some you're going to love and some you're not going to love. It's just, that's the way it is. In any job, that's how it is. We're not perfect. We're not robots, and we never will be. And I don't think we can be replaced by robots for what we do. So I, I don't know where else to go with that one. That was very
Well,
open ended.
Well, the when we were watching the Harry Potter movies, like when you see all the different types of teachers, like one of the things that like I've told I'm pretty sure I've like, said to our kids was like, when you have like, I think my daughter like doesn't like her science teacher say, is always say like, look, school is preparing you for real life. And it isn't just about what you learned. Yeah, you're probably not going to use the mathematics that you learned in ninth grade or 10th grade and whatever, but you are going to learn how to deal with a boss who's got all those different like kind of it's almost like archetype like personalities. Like you're going to have the boss who's like a real stickler for details. You're going to have the one that's completely unreasonable. You're going to have the one that you really like and trust. And I feel like that's what school is really preparing you for. It's almost like it's as much socializing you as it is anything else. And I think, to me, like I see this in the working world here in New York, is that like I think like we all need to get back together, like the whole like video connections and all that stuff. Like it's a good as if there's no other alternative. But I think that like the actual human interaction is so valuable. And I look forward to the day when we're past this whole thing and where we can kind of see each other and have the random interactions that you have in school and the random people and all that stuff. Like I can't wait. And I think that's kind of lost on, I think when you instinctively think about schools, it's not just about the grades at all. At
I
least I don't think
100%
it is.
agree. 100%
So
agree.
So I probably wish I knew that a little bit more when I was in high school, but but I don't, before we get towards the end of this, I wanted to kind of read a couple of things here, Frank, and just because I think they should be read. I think I'm putting you on the spot here a little bit, but it's I think more because I saw this on the high school's website, and they did some teacher spotlight, I think for you in like March of 2017. And I saw all these different quotes, and I think that they seem to me to be like you, but I think that they should be shared with whoever else listens to this to know the kind of person that you are. The one quote was from somebody was, Mr. Vito opened my eyes to a new perspective of the world. And another person said, I've never met a teacher who was so involved in his students' lives in and outside of the classroom. I think that was a good comment.
No, it is. It is. It was.
Yeah. Somebody else said he impacts the whole school in a positive way. Somebody else said, and I think this must be the librarians, they said he's a great guy who remembers us every year with carnations here at the library. He recognizes all the work we do. He's a fan of the library, and we love that. Somebody else just wrote Mr. Vito is the best with like 25 exclamation points. And then somebody else said Mr. Vito takes the classroom learning experience to a higher level by dedicating every ounce of his being to putting enthusiasm into the lessons.
That last one is, I feel it. The energy coming. I tell my students all the time that they're surprised when I'm very hyper. Right at 8 o'clock in the morning when school starts, they're like, "Did you have an extra cup of coffee this morning?" I'm like, "No, I don't drink coffee. It's just history. It's a natural drug." And it's such a dad joke, but I love saying it.
So,
Just because I'm hoping that's the one thing. The love of my subject, the love of teaching it, the love of them getting it. That's what I'm always going for in class. Thanks for reading those quotes. Yeah, I will say that spotlight thing was started back in 2017, and I was the first spotlight teacher that was recognized. So that was a special honor I had. I did win Teacher of the Year at this school in 2012, which is so long ago now.
Yeah, what's happened? It's been 10 years.
I know. So I'm like, I could win it again, but it's going to be tough. There's a lot of good teachers in my school, so hopefully it always goes to good teachers.
It's like winning the Cy Young Award or MVP.
I don't know about that.
If you get it one more time, you get into the Cranford High School Hall of Fame,
that,
probably. I
that would be fantastic.
think. So seriously, like, I mean, you do this all the time, and like every day you're going to school, and like, well, as a student, you can have an off day. You can just sit back and not raise your hand during class. You can miss homework assignments. As a teacher, you don't have that luxury. So, I mean, do you ever have days where you're just like, oh, like, how do I muster it up? Or do you just kind of make sure you get enough sleep and you're just that energetic?
So, sometimes I guess you have to fake it, but
Uh-huh.
I'm going to say most of us that we're not faking it. We're giving it our all. And not every lesson is going to go perfectly, and you learn from that, and you reflect, and you do it better the next time. But you're like I said earlier, you're always on. So if you are faking it, the students are going to know, and that's the coolest thing. So especially when I was a younger teacher, I felt that sometimes that they knew, and they would they might share that with me, or they sometimes do share about another teacher. Yeah, you know what, they didn't know what the heck they were doing today. But I feel like as you go on, just like with any other job, you get better at it. You learn the ins and outs, and how to get through it, even on those days that aren't your best. You still try to give it your best.
Yeah. Wow. Well, um, so you're known for wearing costumes for your classes.
No, 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 no. I'd
Mm.
never have worn a costume
You were
in my like in front of the class. I had
you
dressed up for Halloween as
okay.
historical figures.
Okay.
So I was Uncle Sam once. I was a patriot. I was I'm trying to think some other weird. I was an astronaut, like things like that. I tried to be historical a lot of years in some of my costumes, but I never have dressed up in as a character for something in my class. I may have tried to do voices or something like that, but no. I do wear crazy shirts lately.
Okay.
That I'll this shirt is from a company called Roosevelt's, and this is Teen Wolf on
Uh,
my shirt. But
nice.
some have George Washington on them, some have Abraham Lincoln,
Uh-huh.
stars and stripes and patriotic stuff. But maybe that's my costume with my khaki pants.
I like the product placement there, Frank. That
Yeah,
was good.
that's good. Roosevelt's Roosevelt's.com without the vowels. It's a growing company that I support.
That's good. So what other what garb would you, if you could wear something else, like what would you like to wear for one of those, like for one of those classes, or that you haven't been able to pull off?
All right, so I would love for Halloween to dress like Abraham Lincoln,
Hmm.
and I've tried on the hat and the fake beard, and it just does not look well on me. I'm too short. My face is too round. I cannot pull off Abraham Lincoln, but I would
Mm.
love to.
Mm.
Um, the one that I probably could pull off, and that I should do, but the costume probably is more expensive than a every everyday Party City costume, would be Teddy Roosevelt, because he's one of my favorite presidents. So I probably could pull off him. So maybe I'll do that someday.
Yeah. Yeah. um and I think we talked before, so like you teach history, but you also teach a class about the Holocaust and tolerance and stuff like that. One of the things that I guess we think about is like, history. We've been living through history, and I guess we're always living through history, but I think that the last few years are certainly something that is going to be in the history books itself. um Taking one of the things that you said about like what you teach your kids about, like, you learn the past to kind of confront the present, and I guess kind of shape the future, is Like, what do you feel like you've like? How have those lessons kind of been applicable now? Like, would you see the past kind of like what's I guess what's been going on in your mind as you're watching history unfold in front of you now?
I'm always, hoping that we're better today than we were yesterday. We're better today than we were 10 years ago or 50 years ago. So, it's been very interesting the last, 5, 10 years in regards to that, thinking, are we better? That's a question mark I have sometimes with myself and society. But I want us to say the answer still is yes. But I think we could always do better. I think, humans are always evolving, but we could always improve. So, whether it's technology or whether it's social interactions, I think it's all there, and it's alive and moving. But one thing that that is so important to not just my history teaching, but definitely my Holocaust and genocide studies class, and maybe even my AP government class, is the idea of tolerance and acceptance of differences. And just the way we look at each other is so important, and we have to respect each other's opinions and respect each other's thoughts, even if they're different than our own.
Hmm.
And one thing we have to learn about ourselves too is that sometimes we're not going to be perfect, and we have to accept that the imperfections in our own life. And that's something I hope I impart in my students. Maybe even more than a specific history lesson of something that happened 50 years ago or 100 years ago.
Yeah. The thing that I think about, because I was a history major as well, U.S. history, is the there's always been times in our history where things aren't necessarily going as well as you think, and in fact, like it's not like this is like it's not going back very far in history. I mean, like 9/11 was, and it was a very traumatizing experience. I was living here in the city when that happened, and that was really kind of upended things. The 90s, I think, was probably a pretty like it was probably a pretty easy time. I think if you, in relative to like the last 100 years when you really think about it. But we went to high school when there was still the threat of nuclear Armageddon. Like, I mean, I think it's it's easy to forget. Like, it's like people think, oh, it's so hard right now. It's like, you know what? No, like a lot of us remember what it was like to wake up every day with that specter of, yeah, no, we there. I remember looking to the west from Smithtown and just thinking like, yeah, there could be a mushroom cloud over New York City. Like, I mean, that was always there as a possibility, and that's terrifying. And then you go back to the 70s and you think about what it was like with like the oil crisis and whatever else, and then think about what it must have been like in 1968 and then the 60s. And it doesn't. It's I think in some respect, like you need to, the history I think informs you enough to realize that there's always things that are unsettled. Like even the idea of going back to the Revolutionary War, there were plenty of people who weren't necessarily supporting the Revolutionary War, but it kind of happened anyway. And I think if you, to me, the value of history is it kind of, if you really take the lesson, I guess if you embrace the full lesson of history, is that it's never perfect. It's always messy, and that arc of history, if it's bending forward, sometimes hits a rough spot, and you got to kind of push it forward, push it up, and kind of be patient, and but also appreciate the progress that's been made. I mean, I think to the idea of tolerance, there are issues now, but I think that to the extent that there's, like racism would be just one example, but to the extent there's still things going on there, it's a different form than it was a generation or two ago. And go on.
No, so yeah, when you were saying that, I was thinking about to think that we've had the internet for 20 something years, and that's it though, only 20 something years. TV, what we've had for 70 years, 80 years, electricity for 100 and something years. But so that means like 150 years ago, which isn't that long ago, people were still just, farming. That's it. That was their whole life.
Yeah.
Was just waiting for the sun to go down so they can just go inside and light a candle and go to bed and wake up in the next morning and, oh, the sun's up. I got to go farm again. So we've come such a long way in 150 years. So where we're going to be in another 150 years. Like, we shouldn't dwell on the negative. We should dwell on the positives of what we have right now and how we can make our lives better, instead of just arguing about, some random issue that maybe isn't even that important, in the realm of humanity.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like you can look at the newspaper, and there's a lot of the stuff really doesn't it isn't necessarily important. But maybe it wasn't like to go back to history. There was yellow journalism that caused the Spanish American War. So newspapers kind of misleading people or stoking passions is not a new thing. And the other thing to think about is just I mean, the press, like when you think about how much is out there, back in the 60s and the 70s there was three newscasters, right? There was just like ABC, NBC, CBS. That was it. Like that's amazing to think about. That was all the channels of communication, and it was all like downward. And nowadays it's kind of all over the place. And is it uncomfortable? Sure, but again, to go back to history, the printing press caused it was a transformative invention, and in the end, I think humanity was better for it. We're better to not have the aristocracy. We're better to have democracy. And now everybody has a printing press in their hands. And is it going to cause some change and stuff? Sure, but I think in the long run, to me at least, it's if you're going to go by history, the more access people have to information and communication, in the end, the better it is.
Yeah, I mean, you have to realize that Thomas Jefferson and John Adams each had newspapers to talk trash about each other, and
Right,
Hamilton thrown in the mix too. So
right,
it was like it was happening then, and it still happens now. But like you said, I think we're the better for it because the more communication we have should make us more connected, not more disconnected. And
right,
that's what we have to remember, that we're all in this together. What whether you want to look at just the 340 million Americans or the billions of people around the world, you know we're here, we're doing this together, not separate, and we're more together. I mean, we could be doing this podcast not just from New York to New Jersey, but you could be interviewing someone in China right now.
yeah,
And that's amazing, where you couldn't do that, like I said, 20 something years ago. And
right,
that's the power of the future. It shouldn't be a negative power, it should be a positive power.
right. And I think the idea of tolerance, it does go to that next level, which is we've I think we're far better off, and it is a more tolerant society on many levels. But I think now with the internet foisting so many ideas from so many different corners, as well as I'm sure there are bad actors who are throwing things out there that aren't really even part of the conversation. But we do have to practice tolerance of ideas, and learning how to accept things that we don't agree with. And like are there things that are maybe deal breakers? Sure, but like I think like we all need to embrace a little bit more, like I don't know, I don't care, it doesn't impact me, or I should learn more, or maybe I don't understand the perspective. Like I think there's ways to get around the problems, and there's ways to kind of like really kind of build on everything, because there's a lot of good ideas that are out there, and there's a lot of viewpoints that really should be considered. And I think that, to me, that's the lesson learned from the last few years, is that we need to listen to everyone, not just the causes that we're sympathetic to, but all the voices that are out there. And that's a hard thing to do, but I think we'll get there.
I love it.
so um so Frank, I'd like to close, and we're just passing the 60-minute mark here. So we should probably wrap up, because I'm sure we both have things we need to do. But like, what gives you hope at the end of each day?
So I think I mentioned it before. Just being in the classroom, if I'm with my students, is getting that feeling that they're on the same page, that they want the world to be a better place. We're learning from our mistakes in the past, whether it's going over the Holocaust or another genocide, or some other issue that I'm teaching them. But what can we gain from that to make us to have a better future? Because I mean, that's why we teach history classes. You know there's loads of other things in there in regards to civics, and hey, you should know about this random war and something great that happened, an invention. But it's not just that. It's to say, all right, that's where we were, we're here today, and how are we going to make it better tomorrow? That's really the way I look at each day. let's make tomorrow a better day. It's such an easy thing to say, but I really try to instill that in my students. Whether they're walking in or they're walking out of my classroom, I'm hoping that they feel good about themselves and where we're going.
That's great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Frank, for doing this, and thank you for for molding all those young minds that are out there in the past and going forward. But thanks so
Thanks
much
for
for joining
having
us,
me.
Frank. Yeah, it's been great. Thank you. All right. Have a good night.
Have a good night.